Right, in this video, we're going to be looking at a guide of all of the new fancy CSS that's being used in the year 2020. Now, each one of these features in this guide could be really individual tutorials. This is going to be a really information-dense video with just a lot of topics meant for you as a starting point to kind of learn what's coming down in CSS, and then you can research those on your own. I'll put some links down in the description for a few timestamps, as well as some of the videos that I've already covered on these topics if you want some further research. So please like and subscribe and share this content, and let's get started. Now we're going to follow this simple basic outline. We're going to be first looking at CSS features that are sort of currently used, that are fairly new in the CSS world. Then we're going to be looking at CSS frameworks. We're going to be looking at some future CSS features that are sort of on the way and coming in browsers soon. We're going to be looking at some CSS pre-processors, finally some style guides, and then lastly some resources that you can use for your CSS endeavors. So part one, the features. Now, one of the biggest features that's kind of come along in the last year or two that's going to see, I think, mass adoption in 2020 is the CSS grid. So I see this growing in popularity a lot. It's now supported. The basic grid is now supported in almost all browsers. And I think coming soon in this browser, you're going to see CSS subgrid supported. I believe Firefox already currently supports it as of this recording. Another feature that is going to expand is the grid gap property we saw in CSS grid. So instead of declaring like we used to do here, we used to say grid dash gap. I guess not used to, we still do. But we're going to see that just become gap. And we'll be able to use that gap property in other layout methods like flexbox and columns and things like that. So the grid gap property is going to expand to other layout methods. Another thing that's coming down the way is CSS multi-column layouts. So traditionally this has been done with either floats or flexbox, or way back in the day tables, and now CSS grid. But there's a new property coming down the works that is CSS columns. So you can declare columns and you can have your content naturally flow. The benefit of here is that this paragraph naturally flows up into this paragraph, and this paragraph naturally flows up into that one. So if you resize these columns, it's also responsive. You get the automatic text that just reflows and resizes between various columns, which is a very nice feature. We also have CSS custom properties. Now these are sometimes called CSS variables. They've been around for a little bit, but the idea behind them is we can now declare a variable, if you will, in CSS using the dash dash syntax. So declare a variable and then some of the properties that are assigned to that variable. And then later on down in your CSS, you just put it inside of a variable like this, and I can then reuse that, as many times as I want down through my CSS. So I think we're going to see mass adoption of custom properties. And then I think what you're going to see is also frameworks will begin to adopt this. So traditionally, all that variable work has been done in Sass or other pre-processors, but I think you're going to see more customization available in the frameworks via CSS custom properties instead of your Sass and other less variables, etc. All right, we're going to be seeing box alignment. So Flexbox introduced this many years ago, and it's now been split out as a separate module. So the things like your justify items, justify self, justify content, align items, align self, align content, those are also working on other layout methods. So not just in Flexbox, but you can now use them in grid, etc., in other layout methods. So the box alignment is sort of expanding as well. Here's a couple of new features that are seeing some use early on here in 2020. So there's this one right here called the prefers color scheme. And this is a media query. Dark OSs, a dark operating system or a dark user interface is kind of popular right now. So what this allows you to do is change your website's color scheme based on the operating system setting. So if the user in their operating system has dark mode enabled, you can then also configure some CSS rules to match that dark mode and turn your website dark. There's another thing in here that's the @supports rule. So this is kind of fancy because it's basically like feature detection in CSS. So traditionally feature detection has always been done in JavaScript, but we can now do some basic feature detection using this @supports. So in other words, if the browser supports grid, then the following rules and properties will behave. And then we can use this not selector. So if they do not support this is sort of the inverse. Then we can, of course, add some CSS if they don't support a specific feature. So there you go, add supports. Another fancy one here is the scroll snap property that people are using. So this one is useful. It's kind of like smooth motion-based snapping. So you can see here there's a little scroll snap type, and you can set a couple of properties here. Basically, this allows you, when you're using your finger and you flick this or scroll up and scroll down, instead of just having a linear motion, it sort of moves with inertia and slides up and then kind of bounces and snaps right to an exact point. So that is common, I think, or useful for carousels and other things like that. We have a property called clip path. So this is a CSS property. You can see here there's a prefix, but it's the clip path property. And this allows you to take an image. So for example, this image used to be full like this, and I can then clip that image along a specific polygon. In this case, I can clip this area out over here and have only the remaining area visible. So we can do this with CSS shapes like I'm doing here. You can also clip it with SVG rules and a few things like that in URLs. But that's the basic gist behind the clip path. You can clip an area by a mathematical shape. We also have CSS masks. Now, CSS masks are sort of raster-based images. They're like a traditional alpha mask that we can now use in CSS. So what we can do here is you can see I can just have an image, and then I have another alpha mask image. And when we composite these two together via a CSS mask, you get the completed image with all the little effects happening on that as well. So CSS masks are coming along the way, and some very interesting and cool use cases can be done with CSS masking. All right, just a couple more honorable mentions. Of course, like I mentioned, we're not going to get to, this is just a subset, but we have, some new units, VW, VH, Vmax, Vmin. We have a min height property. We can now change the caret color. So that's the cursor, right, that blinks. You can change that caret color if you want in CSS. We have CH units. We have angles, CSS angles, so we can do things in degrees, gradients, radians, and turns. I have a tutorial on that in my tutorial on conic gradients, CSS conical gradients, that use those. And then, of course, we do have the new cone-based conical gradients for doing gradients that sort of go like that. So they wrap around a center point like that, like pie charts. So those are a few honorable mentions there. Let's look at some of the CSS frameworks before we get into the new features that are coming down the road. So CSS frameworks, the one that's gaining the most popularity in 2020 is this one called Tailwind CSS. It is a utility-first style framework. So in this framework, a lot of people don't like Tailwind because if you look at the HTML, you'll have a lot of class names in your HTML. But it is gaining popularity. It's utility first, and it makes for rapid prototyping pretty easy. Another one that's coming down the pipes is Bootstrap 5, set to release in 2020 sometime. So in Bootstrap 5, new from version 4, is they are dropping dependency on jQuery. So that, I suppose, is a big one because they've had jQuery dependency since the beginning, I think. So they're dropping that. They're possibly going to be introducing the CSS grid in their grid column layout, which right now uses floats and Flexbox still. And they're also going to be introducing their own icon set, possibly with their own SVG icons called boot icons or something like that. So they've got a set already on their GitHub repo, but they're going to be introducing their own SVG icons to use in the framework. So that will be coming out. I'm sure it will be popular as it always has been. We have another one called Tachyons. This one is what we call like a CSS toolkit. It's not a full-fledged entire framework. It's sort of more minimal. So if you're interested in something that's not so heavyweight or more minimal, then maybe want to check out. There's also the Pure CSS, which is another minimal framework that just is sort of has the basic, a grid, and a few things like that. Here's some other popular frameworks. There's the Foundation is a big one, Materialized CSS, Semantic UI, Bulma, and Get UI Kit. So those are all additional frameworks that are popular. Again, there are, I don't know, maybe hundreds more of CSS frameworks, but these are just some of the popular ones in 2020. All right, let's look at the future of CSS. So things that are now coming down the pipeline that aren't maybe fully implemented or only have partial support in some browsers or maybe are hidden behind flags. So one of the big ones that people talk about is CSS Houdini. So Houdini is a set of low-level APIs that exposes basically the entire CSS engine. And this allows for really amazing customization to be done. But it's sort of broken down into these 6 APIs. So you have a parser API, the properties and values, typed OM, the layout API, the painting API, and they're done through worklets. So this enables you to basically sort of create your own, like if you don't like CSS Grid and you don't like CSS Floats and you come up with some alternate layout engine to work on the web, you can actually create it in CSS Houdini and it will work in all browsers. So very cool stuff that is possible here. All right, a few new features that are coming as well. So we have the scroll snap that I've already mentioned that has native scroll inertia. We have a property coming called Focus Within, which allows for accessibility fixes when you're focusing within an element. We have this prefers, like I mentioned, but there's a lot more. I mentioned the color scheme one, but there's a lot more additional ones that you can add on here. In other words, we can adjust the UI UX according to device preferences. We have a thing called logical properties. This is a really cool one. I like the idea behind this, but instead of having like your traditional top, bottom, left, right sort of layout, you have block start, block end, inline start, inline end. So this allows you to lay out your layout in a sort of agnostic way that can be used in right to left languages or left to right languages as well. We have a new position called sticky. I have a video also dedicated on this one, but this allows you to keep your user interface within the viewport when the user scrolls to specific snap points. We have a new thing called backdrop filter, and this allows you to style certain adjustments behind an element, which is kind of really cool. Like you can blur out something behind an element if you want to. A few more features. So we have a new thing coming along the lines that's called. So a few new features we have in CSS as well. More new CSS. We have this is selector, which is sort of a combination of the any and matches. Any and matches, you'll see in a minute, are also some new ones. We have a new RG, so we traditionally have in hex values 6 digits, right? RGBA, but now we have RGBA in alpha. I said that wrong. We traditionally have RGB. Now we have this new syntax where we can declare hexadecimal values, and we have the AA for the alpha value at the end, leading for 8 total digits. We have the subgrid in CSS I mentioned. We have CSS regions. We have CSS modules. We have this new display outer inner. So that's kind of a new syntax for display. We also have size, where we can do a width and a height. And we have this aspect ratio property where we can size things based on the aspect ratio. We have custom elements, like you can create your own tags, right? Like I create a follow Andrew tag and embed that inside of a custom element. That one's duplicated there. We have the all property. So this is a useful property where you can reset all of the properties on a specific element using the all. We have font variants coming down the lines. So you can do things like small caps. You can ask for a small caps font on your font variants. We have a thing called image set. So this allows you, it's kind of like the HTML source set in your HTML. This allows you to specify a set of images that are responsive based on the user resolution in your CSS. We also have several new color methods. So instead of just the traditional RGB or RGBA, we have lab color, we have gray, LCW, HWB. That's hue, whiteness, and blackness, I think. Anyway, so several new color methods coming down the line. And then we also have some additional math that's been proposed. So we've already seen the calc where we can do calculations. We have coming down min, max, clamps, sine, cosines, and then these are all proposed as well. Things like tangents, hypotenuse, square root, powers. So all these different math functions we're going to soon be able to be using in CSS as well. Okay, so that's kind of things that are coming down the line to look out for in CSS. Now in part 4, we're going to be looking at some of the CSS pre-processors that are being used in 2020. So first off, we have Sass. Sass is, there's the URL there. Just go to sass-lang.com. And there is some the idea of CSS pre-processing is that you can sort of introduce programming logic into your CSS. So all of these CSS preprocessors have a same goal of introducing that. So there's Sass and kind of some little sample Sass code there. Another one is less, and there's some sample less code. You can see you can declare variables, and then I can do calculations on those variables and add those down there. We have stylus. So stylus is another CSS preprocessor. One thing about stylus is that you'll notice that they don't have any like semicolons or curly braces and things like that. Everything is based off of tabs, spacing and whatnot. So they've eliminated a lot of those things in their language. And then post CSS, which is kind of gaining, I think, a lot of popularity lately. But post CSS is another preprocessor, which has a lot of plugins and integrations that can really extend this language as well. So that's kind of the main 4 or 5. There's some other CSS preprocessors. I cannot say that word. There's some other CSS preprocessors, but they are not included in here because they're not quite as popular. So part 5, we're going to be looking at some of the CSS style guides, or you could call these CSS methodologies. So we have the BIM. The URL there is getbim.com. So this is the block element modifier. That's where it gets its acronym from. And it's a methodology that lets you create reusable components in your CSS by following that BEM model. So their website, of course, has all the documentation for following that methodology. There's this one here called Atomic CSS. So this one allows you to style your components directly. There's another one here called OOCSS. This stands for Object-Oriented CSS. Again, just another methodology for helping you write code. All of these CSS methodologies or style guides really help when you're working with larger projects or projects where you're sharing code with other developers. You sort of want, it's almost like a programming style guide. This is a CSS style guide. So if everyone's sort of working in the same way, it makes managing and maintaining those projects much easier. And another one here that's more for components is Suit CSS. So there's the URL as well. Again, there's several other ones here. Something popular that's been happening a lot in the last year or two is CSS in JavaScript. So whether that's through styled components or modules or styled JSX, there's a bunch of other little sort of ones down here, JSS, Glamour, Aphrodite. So anyway, these are just another way that people have been working with CSS by actually moving that off into JavaScript. All right, and last slide here is CSS resources that you can look at. So I'm just going to list them here. This is just a single slide, but CSS Tricks is a website about CSS and everything CSS. Smashing Magazine is a blog, sort of magazine, about web technology, CSS, web design, all sorts of good things. Code Drops is another CSS website. They also have a lot of tools on their website. I don't know what we call these, CSS references and things like that. List Apart is a blog that's been around for quite some time that just talks about everything web. The MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, is Firefox's or Mozilla's rather network of documentation for the web. CodePen is the free online code editor from the guys actually initially behind CSS Tricks. Free Code Camp is a website that has tutorials and sort of classes and things like that, where you can learn to code and write HTML and CSS for free. And you just sign up and you sort of have worklets. Scrimb is a kind of a fancy little website that allows you to follow along tutorials that are written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and actually live edit the tutorial code while you're watching it. So Can I Use is a website that shows you what current properties in CSS are adopted by all the major browsers. So it'll show you if the property is available or what percentage of browsers use that. Front-End Masters is a paid course where you'll follow along several instructors that just lead you through front-end development, really. Pluralsight is a platform for learning. Again, this is a sort of a learning engine where you sign up for Pluralsight, and they have tens of thousands of videos, likely, on various subjects. Painting, web design, they have programming, everything. Same with lynda.com. They're a platform where you sign up and you can watch videos from different instructors and take online courses. Syntax is a podcast. For those of you who want to listen to podcasts, this is a web design or a web-based podcast. So is the Shop Talk Show. There's a new website that's becoming fairly popular in 2020 called dev.to. And it is sort of like Medium, but in the niche or niche of web designers, front-end designers. So it's kind of a fun little website gaining quite a bit of popularity. And then we have, I just call this DevTubers. I see a lot of new channels on YouTube that are popping up, and I'm calling these people DevTubers. So they're just programming or web design or front-end UI UX channels where people are teaching things on YouTube, like myself. So there's just this list of resources there for you. I hope you picked up a few tips or tricks in this simple guide of CSS in the year 2020. Really, every single one of these slides could be an hour-long tutorial. So I will plan on covering many of the different aspects throughout these slides in this upcoming year and video tutorials for you all. Please subscribe to the channel, share this video so that we can continue to grow and put out more free content for those of you to learn. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.